Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. Today's daf in the Dirshu daf Yomi halachah is Kuf Tes Amud Aleph. Right now, we are going to be doing for now Kuf Ches Amud Beis. I hope maybe later today I'll post a second video to catch us up to the Dirshu schedule, but we'll see how it goes. For now, we are beginning on the very bottom line of Kuf Ches Amud Aleph. We are in Hilchos Yom Tov. We're continuing to learn Siman Tov Tzadik Ches, and we begin with Siv Zayin on the bottom line of Kuf Ches Amud Aleph. Says the Mechaber, "Im shachat behema basodeh." Let's say you shechted an animal on Yom Tov out in the field, and over here we're talking about a typical case of shechitah that's mutter on Yom Tov, even though shechitah is a halachah. However, it's a halachah that's mutter l'tzarech ochel nefesh. If you require to shecht an animal in order to have meat for Yom Tov, and you want to shecht an animal so you can have a nice fleish gesuda, the shechitah is mutter. So you shechted an animal out in the field, and now you have to transport the meat of the animal. You got to bring it inside. You have to do all the preparations. So the Mechaber says, "Lo yiviyena b'moit oy b'moita kederech she'oisa b'chol." The way they would normally transport the meat back in those days is they would load the animal, or the large, primal sections of the meat. They would load it onto poles. Now, it seems from the Mefarshim, we have two different Lashonos over here in the Mechaber. We have a moit and a moita. And it seems from the Pri Megadim that a moit is a pole, a very large pole, that was typically carried with two people. So you slung the carcass of the animal over a pole, and you had two people, one holding one end of the pole, the other one carrying the other end of the pole, and you transport the carcass that way. Then there was a moita, which is a smaller pole, where you draped the meat over the pole, and one person held that pole over his shoulder. Either way, the Mechaber says, it's not appropriate to transport the carcass or the meat of the animal in this way on Yom Tov, which is the way you would do it during the week. And we turn to Kuf Ches Amud Beis on top. Or rather, Yiviyena biyadai evarim. Instead of transporting the animal this way on poles, you should rather cut up the carcass into various limbs, cut it up into various cuts, and carry, a little bit at a time by hand. Let's see what's going on here. It says the Mishnah Berurah nice cut Mem Gimel, which begins on the bottom of Kuf Ches Amud Aleph. Mem Gimel im, and we turn the page to Kuf Ches Amud Beis. Im shachat behema. The Mechaber just wrote this in a simple way. If you shechted an animal, says the Chavetz Chaim midas sasam, since the Mechaber wrote it in this simple way, mashma, the implication is the af bebehema beria dina hachi. This halachah that the Mechaber is discussing over here has nothing to do with the previous sif, where we were talking about an animal that's ill and you had to shecht it on Yom Tov because you're afraid it might die. Over here in this halachah, we're talking about any time you do shechitah, whether it's shechitah of a healthy animal or an ill animal, it doesn't matter. If you shecht an animal and you have a carcass that you need to transport, you don't transport it on the poles, you transport it by hand. Now, why is this? Let's see the Mishnah Berurah is cut Mem Dalet. Yiviyena biyadai, instead of transporting it on poles, you should carry cuts, individual cuts by hand. Even though by virtue of the fact that you're going to cut the carcass up into different parts, now you're going to have to make many more trips in order to transport the meat. Still, it is preferential from the standpoint of Kavod Yom Tov and Hilchos Yom Tov. It is preferential to cut the carcass up into cuts and make more trips to carry the meat, rather than putting it on a pole and doing it all in one trip. And here is where the Chavetz Chaim tells us what the problem over here is. The problem over here is that if you drape the carcass over poles and you transport it that way, which is the typical way you would do it during the week, it looks like you're busy with weekday activities on Yom Tov. And that is not Kavod Yom Tov. That is Zilzul Yom Tov. We're shaming Yom Tov. We're treating Yom Tov in a very light way. It looks like the Yom Tov is a weekday. We don't want Yom Tov to look like a weekday. The Pri Megadim proves from the words of the Ran that Let's say somebody says he wants to transport the carcass on poles, but he's going to do it with some kind of shinui. He's going to do it in an unusual manner so that it's obvious that he's not doing it the way it's done during the week. Still, it appears from the words of the Ran that is not sufficient. We don't want you to do this in any way that it looks like weekday activity. So instead of transporting it by poles, we cut it up into parts and we transport the animal a little bit at a time, some meat at a time, evarim. And it says the Chavetz Chaim, let's say you're in a situation where you can't do this. It's just not practicable for you to cut the animal up into parts and transport a little at a time. Kigoyin, for example, let's say you have guests that are already in the house and you need to prepare the Suda. So I don't have time to make 15 trips going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I got to get into the kitchen and I got to prepare the Suda. Nira, the Chavetz Chaim says, it appears, the mutter lahavi al yedei umoita, then it would be mutter to transport the carcass using these types of poles. And he's bringing this down from the Berurah. If you're dealing with a misukenes, you should be machmer. This kula that we have over here, where we say that if it's just not practicable for you to transport it by hand, you could transport it with poles. That's only when you're shechting a healthy animal and you're shechting it really l'tzarech suda. You're really doing it l'tzarech echel nefesh. But if we're talking about the misukenes, the animal that we were afraid was going to die, and really the only reason you're shechting it is not for echel nefesh purposes, really you're doing it to save yourself from a hefsid meruba, then you should not be makel, and you'll have to figure out some way of transporting it a little bit at a time. Now, I would just point you to the Biur Halacha on Kuf Ches Amud Aleph, on the bottom line of the Biur Halacha. It's the Biur Halacha Divrei Amaschil Shachat Behema Basada Lo Yiviena. The words of the Chavetz Chaim over here, I think, give us a little further insight into what the real problem over here is. Says the Chavetz Chaim, what are we talking about? Shachat Behema Basada, if you shechted an animal in the field, Lo Yiviena, you should not bring it, says the Chavetz Chaim, le'ir. Do not transport the carcass to the city. Oy b'rishos harabim, or through the streets of the rishos harabim. Kahai gavna, in this way, using kahai gavna d'shchichei rabim. In these cases where it's very public, where the public is standing around, it's a public place. So what's the problem over here? The reason the Biur Halacha brings this down over here from the Pri Megadim, the name of the Magen Avram, the reason he brings this down is to show you what the problem is. The problem is that you're allowed to do the shechitah. It's no problem. You're doing the shechitah l'tzarech echel nefesh, and you're allowed to do the haitzah. You're allowed to transport the animal, the carcass, to wherever it needs to get for its preparation purposes l'tzarech echel nefesh. But if you're going to do it with these poles, the way it's done during the week, and you're going through a rishos harabim, you're going in a public thoroughfare, everybody looks, and what they see is, they see a person doing uvda d'chayil. They see a person comporting himself on Yom Tov as if it's a weekday. And that creates a zilzal in Yom Tov. Therefore, if this is something that would be happening in private, if this is something that would be happening in an area where there's nobody around, it's not a rishos harabim, then the halacha is really, then you can transport it using poles. And I think there's a Dirshu footnote over here. Yeah, there is. Dirshu footnote number 40. He brings down here, if you're transporting the meat through an area where the public is not there, where it's not common, not only they're not there, you can't go out in the street and say, okay, there's nobody here, it's quiet right now, I'll do it with poles. No, if it's rishos harabim, if it's a makom sheshchichi rabim, if it's a place where the public usually comes there, you cannot do it with poles, even if there happens to be nobody there now. But if it's a makom sheshchichi rabim, if it's a place where you don't get people coming around, and there's nobody there to see you, then the Ramah writes later in Siman Taf Kuf Yud and Siv Ches, and you look at the words in the Mishnah Berurah there in Siv Kat and Chavtes, if somebody has a Yom Tov need to transport jugs of wine from one place to the other, if there's no kshash of people looking at you and looking and seeing that you're comporting yourself in a weekday manner, then you could carry a lot of drugs at once, and you don't have to make a bunch of trips. Mishnah Berurah Sham, and the Chavetz Chaim writes over there in the Mishnah Berurah, when the rabbim is not around, when we don't have this chash that people are going to look at you and say that you're doing uvda d'chayil, then we would rather that you make less trips and schlep a lot at one time, even though that's the normal weekday way of doing it. So this whole problem is only when the rabbim is going to see you, or there's at least a good chance. It's a makom sheshchichi rabbim. Then you cannot use the moit because it looks like uvda d'chayil. I had an interesting case where this halacha applied. We were making a bar mitzvah. It was back when we lived in Edison, and the bar mitzvah suda was taking place in the Aguda, which was not quite up the block, but we lived on Lexington Avenue, and the Aguda is on the corner of Lexington and Raritan, so it's like a long 2 blocks up, and we had to move a lot of soda, 2-liter bottles of soda, over to where the bar mitzvah was. So the question that I was asked was, could we take a hand truck? I had a hand truck. Could we take a hand truck and stack up a bunch of boxes of 2-liter bottles of soda and push the hand truck over to the shul? And I said no, because that's uvda d'chayil. It looks like you're a delivery person. It looks like taking a hand truck and moving cases of goods. That's not Shabbos. We had an Erev, of course, but that's why this problem comes into play. It looks like uvda d'chayil. It's a zilzal and kavod Shabbos. However, Friday night at midnight, after we were cleaning up and everything else, I said, now you could use the hand truck, because now it's lo shchichi rabim. It's in the dead of the night. I think it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and it was also 102 degrees. It was during a heat wave. And I said, there's nobody out. It's the middle of the night. Now you want to take the hand truck. There were only 2 of us, myself and my wife, and you're going to make many trips in the middle of the night. That's not appropriate either. So we took a hand truck, and we moved a lot of goods on the hand truck at once. Okay. Now we go to Sif Ches. Top line, Kuf Ches Amid Beis. Says the Mechaber. Oif shenidras paraglayim. Let's say you have a chicken and you want to shech the chicken for Yom Tov. Now, this chicken was involved in a little bit of a mishap. Somebody stepped on this chicken. Oif shenidras paraglayim. You have a chicken that was stepped on. It was trampled. Now, when a chicken is trampled, we have a chash that there might be a treifa issue. So, oif shenidras paraglayim. You have this chicken or another kosher bird that was trampled underfoot, and therefore v'yesh lachosh and israsku evarav, and therefore there is makam. There's a reason to be chayshish, to be concerned that maybe one of its limbs were crushed. V'lochein, and because we have this concern, tzarich shehiyah me'es la'es, we need 2 things now in order to render this bird kosher. Normally, a chicken has a cheskes kashrus. A goose, a kosher, a bird, a duck, they have a cheskes kashrus. But over here, there's a reisa in the cheskes kashrus. There's a weakening of the chazaka because it was trampled on. And when a bird gets trampled on, we have to be worried that some of the limbs may have become injured. So now, in order to render this a kosher bird, what we have to do is, the first thing we have to do is we have to wait me'es la'es. We have to wait for a 24-hour period and see, does the bird survive through a 24-hour period? If the bird does survive, then we can go on to the next step. So the first step is the first thing that we have to do is we have to wait 24 hours from the time it was trampled and see if it survives 24 hours. This so far is Hilchas Yeridea. So far we're not discussing Hilchas Yom Tov. This is just Yeridea. A chicken or a duck or a goose, a kosher bird gets trampled on. You want to use it for kosher food. First, you have to wait 24 hours and see if it survives. And then, ubedika achar shechitah. And then after you shecht it, you have to do an internal bedika to make sure that by virtue of the fact that it was trampled, it didn't get any internal injuries. So even though, let's say nowadays when we shecht the chicken, we don't have to do bedikas panimium on chickens. We don't do any internal bedikas really on chickens after shechitah. But if you have a chicken that was trampled on, it needs both of these 2 steps. You have to wait 24 hours, and then you have to do an internal bedika to make sure there are no internal injuries that would render it a treifa. Now the question is, are you allowed to shecht this chicken on Yom Tov. So let's say Yom Tov falls out on a Wednesday. Yom Tov is Wednesday. On Monday, this chicken was trampled on. Okay, so you waited 24 hours. It was trampled on Monday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Now it's Tuesday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So we already waited the 24-hour period. Yom Tov is Wednesday. Now it comes Wednesday, and I need a chicken for my Suda. Some extra guests showed up, and I want to shecht this chicken. I was making it. I looked at my chicken coop before Yom Tov, and I said I might need that chicken on Yom Tov. I was making the chicken for Yom Tov use, and now I want to go ahead and I want to shecht it. Now, this chicken is the one that was trampled on. So we waited 24 hours. The 24 hours are gone. But now after I checked it, I have to do an internal bedika to check for internal injuries. Now, if I do that bedika and I find out that the chicken did suffer internal injuries that render it a treifa, now my shechitah was shaloi l'tzarech. It turns out retroactively that my shechitah was shaloi l'tzarech. So the question is, do we want to put ourselves in that position or not? And that's the halachah that the Mechaber is addressing here. So says the Mechaber, you're allowed to shecht it on Yom Tov. And we're not chayshish. We don't concern ourselves that maybe the animal upon further bedika, maybe the chicken upon further bedika will turn out to be a treifa, and it comes out that the shechitah was shaloi l'tzarech. We don't worry about that. Even though there was a reyasa, even though there was a weakening in its cheskes kashrus, because we know that it was trampled, so there was a weakening of its cheskes kashrus. Still in all, we bank on the cheskes kashrus, and we say you could go ahead and shecht it, and we don't have to worry that it might come out that you did a shechitah shaloi l'tzarech. Now, before I even turn to the Mishnah Berurah, there's a very, very interesting Rabbi Akiva Eger that struck me. The problem struck me right when I learned this halachah, and now I see that Rabbi Akiva Eger talks about it. The case that I gave you was that Yom Tov is Wednesday, and the chicken was trampled on Monday. So I said the chicken was trampled Monday afternoon at 2 o'clock. So when we hit Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, the 24-hour period that we needed to wait is over. And now I want to shecht the chicken on Wednesday. And the problem is that, of course, I didn't do the internal bedikas yet. I didn't shecht it yet. You can't do those before you do the shechitah, right? And the halacha is, says the Mechaber, that you're allowed to shecht it, and we don't concern ourselves. Maybe it'll turn out to be a treifa. But how about if Yom Tov is Wednesday and the chicken was trampled on Tuesday in middle of the night? So Tuesday at 10 p.m., the chicken was trampled on. Now this chicken, you can't shecht this chicken until Wednesday night, 10 p.m., because you have to wait 24 hours for when it was trampled. Oh, when did Yom Tov start? Yom Tov started Wednesday evening at Ben Hashmashas and Shkia time. Was this chicken royal l'shchita at Ben Hashmashas? No, it was not, because at Ben Hashmashas, the 24 hours from the time of the injury weren't up yet. So when Ben Hashmashas of Erev Yom Tov, Ben Hashmashas of Yom Tov, when it arrived, this chicken was not royal l'shchita. Oh, Rabbi Akiva Eger says in that case, the chicken is muktzah. Now you can't check this chicken on Yom Tov because it was muktzah at the time of Ben Hashmashas. At the time of Ben Hashmashas, it wasn't roy for Eichel Nefesh. It wasn't royal l'shchita. It seems to me that there are others who might disagree with this Rabbi Akiva Eger, but it's just, you see from here how broad your mind has to be when you look at a shaila. We're looking at a shaila of a chash. Is there a chash of shechitah shaloi l'tzarech or not? But as a psak, the first question you have to say, wait, when did the injury occur? When was it trampled on? Ooh, so you're telling me that when Ben Hashmashas of Erev Yom Tov came, it wasn't royal l'shchita? Ooh, then it's muktzah. Different problem. Your mind wasn't even focusing in on the shaila of muktzah, but the shaila of muktzah has a bearing on this shaila. Okay. Now let's turn to the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Kat Mem Vav. Since this chicken was trampled upon, v'lachein tzarech shehiyame eis la'eis. The first thing that we need is we have to wait 24 hours. Kedei sheyetze mechshash risuk evarim. Because as long as the animal did not survive yet for 24 hours, we have to be chayshish that maybe a limb was injured. Risuk evarim literally means that a limb was crushed. So we have to see that the animal could survive for 24 hours because the Chazal tell us that an animal who has crushed limbs will not survive 24 hours. So the first thing we do is we wait 24 hours. V'tzarech gam kein bedika, then you need a second step. Then after you shecht it, once the 24 hours are over, now you have to do an internal bedika. Because while it's true that we know that none of its limbs became broken or dislocated or anything else because we waited 24 hours, maybe some kind of weakness occurred to an internal organ, meaning maybe the chicken suffered internal injuries, and it's a treifa by virtue of internal injuries. So we got to wait the 24 hours, and we have to do an internal bedika. Now, they do ask in Yeridea, why isn't it enough to just do an internal bedika? Do an internal bedika and check the limbs of the chicken. Feel the bones of the chicken, to check out the joints of the chicken, make sure nothing is dislocated, make sure nothing is broken, and at the same time check the internal organs. Why do we have to wait 24 hours? And the answer seems to be is that we're afraid when we talk about a crushing of the limbs, we're not necessarily referring to things that are visible. There might have been injuries to the limbs that are not visible. I'm not talking about a dislocation or a break. Somehow there are some types of injuries to the limbs, the Chazal tell us, that are not visible and yet may render the animal a treifa. And the only way to tell is if it lives for 24 hours. Okay. Now we go weiter in Ois Cotton Mem Zayin, right by the Ois Cotton Mem Vav for the Sharet Tzion. Says the Chavetz Chaim, according to the words of the Ramah, in his Hagah in Yeridea Siman Nun Ches Vav, who says that we are no longer knowledgeable enough to do a thorough internal examination of all of the internal organs. This halacha, unfortunately, does not apply to us because the Ramah says in Yeridea, we are not equipped to do the type of internal bedika to assure us that an animal that was trampled on is not a treifa. We don't have that level of knowledge anymore. And therefore, this halacha, unfortunately, doesn't apply because we're not capable of doing this bedika anyway. So once the chicken was trampled on, there's no way for us to render this chicken permissible. We can't render it mutter, and therefore you can't check that on Yom Tov because you're not allowed to eat it. Now, you'll ask me, so why doesn't the Ramah say so over here? You're telling me that according to the Ramah, this whole halachah of the mechaber doesn't apply. So why doesn't the Ramah say so? So the Chavetz Chaim says, the Ramah doesn't point this out here. Obviously, the Ramah was assuming that we all, of course, know what the Ramah said over there in Yeridea. I must mention that the former mashgiach of MTJ, Rav Michal Birnbaum Zechet Tzadik V'Kadosh L'Vracha, who was the mashgiach of MTJ for decades under Rav Moshe Zechet Tzadik V'Kadosh L'Vracha, he would come to the yeshiva every now and then to Staten Island, and he would give a shmooze. He was a tremendous Baal Musar, and he would give a shmooze. And we always said that the most powerful word of Musar that the mashgiach Zatzal ever gave was the word Yadua. It is well known. Why is that? Because whenever he would give a shmooze, whenever he quoted a Maimer Chazal, whenever he quoted a Maimer Chazal, whether it was in Shas Bavli, or it was in Shas Yerushalmi, or it was a Medrash, whenever he quoted a Chazal, he always said, is Yadua. It's well known what Chazal say. So he would say, for example, Yadua, the Gemara in Be'al Lamed Aleph, and he would quote a Gemara. And we would look at each other and we would say, yeah, by the Mashgiach, every Maimer Chazal was Yadua. Everyone was well known. By us, it's not Yadua. So we always said the biggest musar he ever gave us was that word Yadua, that every Maimer Chazal should be well known to you. So the Ramah, he said, what, I got to say it over here in our Chaim if I said it in Yeridea? Obviously, they know Yeridea. What do I got to say it again for? Okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah weiter. Let's go to Ois Cotton Mem Ches. So the halacha is, you're allowed to shecht this chicken that was trampled. You're allowed to shecht it on Yom Tov. And the Mechaber said, we do not concern ourselves that maybe it will turn out that the animal is a treifa, and then we did a shechitah shaloi l'tzarech. Says the Chavetz Chaim, because even though the halacha is that we do have to do an internal examination after the shechitah, so you see, we are concerned about the possibility of the animal being a treifa. Nevertheless, since this fowl did have a cheskes kashrus, because the vast majority of fowl are kosher and they're not treifos, you're still allowed to shecht it on Yom Tov, because we still leave the original cheskes kashrus in place. Even though by virtue of the fact that it was trampled on, it created enough of a reisa in the chazaka that we have to do an internal bedika, but ultimately it still has a cheskes kashrus, and therefore you're allowed to do the shechitah on Yom Tov. Now, it's interesting, because this is based on a Gemara in Beya on Lamed Daled Amud Aleph, where the Gemara over there has an ibaya delay ifshita. That's the Gemara presents a question that the Gemara never really answers. The Gemara clears this suffix over there in Beya on Lamed Amud Aleph. How do we look at this fowl that was trampled on? Do we say that it has a cheskes kashrus or not? And the way the Gemara phrases the question is, Mi mechaskinon reisa. The Gemara doesn't say, do we lose the cheskes kashrus? What the Gemara says is, Mi mechaskinon reisa. Do we go ahead and give strength? Mi mechaskinon. Do we empower the reisa, the weakness? We know that the animal was trampled on. So we know that the Gemara in Chulin tells us that since it was trampled on, it needs shehiyah, you have to wait me'es la'es, and you have to do bedika pnim. That we know that the reisa accomplished that. But mi mechaskinan reisa, do we empower the reisa to the extent that we say that it takes away the cheskes kashrus that the fowl had, and now we mamish have to worry that it may be a treifa, and therefore we can't check that on Yom Tov? And the Gemara doesn't decide the question. And here we have a machlokes rishonim. The Rosh paskins lekula, think the Rashba paskins lekula. Other rishonim are machmir. The Mechaber goes like the Rosh. Okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Eiskat Memtes, Afal Gav de Iskilid Berurah. This is the halacha, even though we have a weakening of the cheskes kashrus. V'hu adin, says the Chavetz Chaim, the same halacha would apply besafik nikuva b'kaitz. Let's say you have an animal that wandered into a thorn bush and it came out a little bit bloodied. So now the question is, was there a thorn that penetrated through to the interior of the animal which could render it a treifa or not? So it's a safik nikuva. It's a suffix whether or not this animal was punctured. In those cases also, you're allowed to shecht the animal. Certainly, when there really is no weakening of the cheskes kashrus at all. Let's say nothing in particular happened to this specific bird. Only thing is, we happen to know that statistically, in this region, when they shecht chickens, when they shecht animals in the slaughterhouse, they have even kosher and treif. It's 50% kosher and 50% treif. So are you allowed to shecht on Yom Tov? Maybe you have to be concerned that the animal that you shecht might be a treifa. And if it's a treifa, you did shechitah shaloi l'tzarech echel nefesh. So says the Chavetz Chaim that according to the Mechaber, no, the Cholsh came, certainly. If there's nothing that happened to this animal in specific that weakened its chazaka, the only question is, there are regions where they have a lot of treifa animals, equal to the amount of kosher animals. Still, we don't have to be chayshish. We don't say that it's asur to shech because maybe it'll turn out to be a treifa. Why? It's 50-50. Why aren't you worried? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, because we still give this animal a chazaka of heter, because very interesting, in your region maybe it's 50-50, but in the world most of the behemoths are kosher. However, v'yesh cholka ma'ikar dina de mechaber. The Chavetz Chaim does bring down the other Rishonim. If you look in the Sha'ar Tzion, he quotes this from the Berurah, the Ra'ah, the Ran. So he says there are those who disagree with this halachah. V'soivrin, and they hold that you can't shecht when some kind of reisa happens to an animal. You have a chicken that was trampled on, you can't shecht it. And also in a region where it's typically 50-50, kosher animals and treif animals, you cannot shecht. The Shari Tshuva says, certainly if you're in a region where the majority of the animals are treifas, even if the reason for the increase in treifas is only because of all the chumras that the achrayim gave over to us, still the bottom line is that more than 50% of the animals are not usable. Then it's not, then you're not allowed to shecht on Yom Tov. Ulamaisa, says the Chavetz Chaim, Ulamaisa halachah lamaisa hechriu ha'achrayim. The achrayim are machriya. He brings this down from the Taz, the Magen Avraham, the Shari Tshuva, and others. The yesh lachush l'deyazu. We have to concern ourselves with this opinion. Ola hachmir, and we rule stringently. Afilu b'mechza al mechza. So even in places where it's 50-50, we don't check. V'hu sha'mechza trefa shamati and trefa gemurais mitzad adin. But that's only true if the reason it's 50-50 is based on ikar adin, on strict halacha, 50% are treifas. But if the reason why there's such a high percentage of treifas is only because of the chumras of the achrayim, then mutar lishchit b'yom tovim im l'tzarich. Then if it's a real tzarich yom tov, you're allowed to shecht on yom tov. And also if you're dealing with a case of hefsid meruba, where you had, let's say, the animal who looks like it's going to die, so you want to shecht it on yom tov to save yourself the hefsid meruba, then also you're allowed to shecht, even if it's 50-50. But if there's no tzarich, then we don't check the animal on Yom Tov at all. I feel like the leishchichi treifas. Called kach shamat treifa. Aval oif noihagen lishchit b'Yom Tov. However, the Chavetz Chaim does say that fowl we are noyig to shecht on Yom Tov. So if you're like me and you got a little chicken coop out back, and you be careful to comply with all the other halachic requirements, it has to be not mechusar tzeda. They have to be already nitzay v'oimid. They have to be trapped, so there's no shiloh tzeda. They have to be muchan. You have to have been mechin the bird for Yom Tov use. Then you're allowed to shecht on Yom Tov. Okay, let's go to Sif Tes. Bechar bizman hazeh, a firstborn animal nowadays. Now we know that the halachah of a bechar behema tahira, when you have the firstborn animal of the kosher animal, what's the halacha? The halacha of a bechar is it has to go to the kohen. Now, the bechar has kedusha, whether it's the zman habayis or not the zman habayis. It's independent of the Beis Hamikdash. The bechar still has kedusha. So even a bechar of a behemoth tahira nowadays has kedushas bechar, and therefore you're not allowed to shecht it. You got to give it to the kohen. Now the problem is the kohen can't shecht it either, because the kohen is supposed to bring it to the Beis Hamikdash and shecht it as a carbon, and he can't. So what do you do with a bechar? Nothing. You let it graze until it gets a mum. Now, when a bechar gets a mum, the halacha of a bechar that's a bal mum is that it's allowed to be shechted and it's allowed to be eaten. The problem is, not the problem, but the halacha also is that when a bechar does get a mum, the status of the bechar has to be decided by a chacham. You have to bring it to a talmid chacham who's a mumcha. He has to be a professional in assessing the injuries of an animal, and he has to decide what kind of mum is this. Is this a mum over? Is this a temporary mum that will heal? Is it a mum kavua? So is it a mum that renders the bechar a true bal mum, so you're allowed to shecht it, or not? So you need a she'elas chacham. You have to bring it to a chacham who's a mumcha. Now the halacha is that nowadays we don't have any mumchim, and therefore the status of a bechar, in the absence of a mumcha, it has to be decided by a panel of 3 talmidei chacham. Okay. So now, what do we do with a bechar on Yom Tov? Bechar bezman hazeh. If you have a bechar behemoth tahira nowadays, she'ena yachal l'shachtoi b'loy mum. Since it's a bechar, you're not allowed to shecht it unless you have a certified mum. The bechar has to have a bona fide injury that was decided upon, was paskin, that this bechar is a bal mum. Ein chacham yachal l'roisei b'Yom Tov im yesh by mum. You're not allowed to show the animal to a psak on Yom Tov. You can't bring the bechar to the mumcha, to the Talmid Chacham on Yom Tov, so that he should paskin if it's a Baal Mum. And not only you're not allowed to bring it to the Talmid Chacham is not allowed to paskin. He's not allowed to go look at the bechar and assess if this is a mum or not. Va'afilu im avar v'ra'ahu, and even if the Talmid Chacham, he forgets this halachah, whatever it is, he's over, and he does look at the mum, and he paskins that it's a Baal Mum, eino yachal l'shachitah. You're not allowed to shecht it. So the two halachas that we have over here, you have the bechar. The first thing is the Talmid Chacham is not allowed to paskin on the status of the bechar on Yom Tov. And therefore, you can't shecht it on Yom Tov because you don't know if it's a Baal Mum or not. And even if the Talmid Chacham was over and he did paskin on it, and he told you it's a mum kavua, and therefore it's a bechar Baal Mum, and you're allowed to shecht it, you're not allowed to shecht it on Yom Tov. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah and see what's going on here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut nun. Ein chacham yachal. A chacham is not allowed to assess the mum of a bechar on Yom Tov and paskin on that mum. Why not? What's the problem? So first says the Chavetz Chaim, this is true, bein shehumam b'Yom Tov, whether the mum happened on Yom Tov, bein shehumam me'erev Yom Tov, or whether the mum happened before Yom Tov. Maybe the mum happened 2 weeks ago, and now it's Yom Tov, and you say, I'm going to go shech that calf. We're going to have some veal for Yom Tov. And then your wife reminds you, hey, it's a bechar, and you didn't get a psak yet. Oh, all right, I'll go ask the Shiloh. No, you're not allowed to go ask the Shiloh. And the fact that the mum happened 2 weeks ago, irrelevant. Now, maybe you would think the other way. Maybe you'll think, okay, if the mum happened 2 weeks ago, so I understand I can't do it on Yom Tov, because I should have done it before Yom Tov. But maybe if the mum just happened now on Yom Tov, so maybe now I could ask the Chacham, no. Whether the mum happened before Yom Tov or the mum happened on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to get a psak on this shaila on Yom Tov. What's the problem? Says the Chavetz Chaim, right by the Oiskat Nun Zayin for the Sharat Tzion, the merze kemisakin, because by the Talmid Chacham paskening on the bechar, that's like tikkun. It's like tikkun moneh. It's like fixing something, repairing something. The Asar b'Yom Tov, tikkun moneh is Asar on Yom Tov. What does this have to do with tikkun moneh? What it has to do with tikkun moneh is before the psak of the chacham, this animal is Asar. After the psak of the chacham, the animal is mutter. So that means that the chacham was misakin the animal. He repaired it, he fixed it, he prepared it for use on Yom Tov. So that's a type of tikkun. So the psak is not allowed to be rendered on Yom Tov because it's merzi kemisakin. It looks like misakin. Now there is another shita in the Rishonim. Just remembering now, there's a Rambam. There's a Rambam that gives a different reason. Let me see if I could find it quickly brought down. There's a Rambam. It didn't strike me when I was preparing. Give me 1 second here. Oh, yeah. Very similar to the Rabbi Akiva Eger that I brought down at the beginning of this year. The Rambam has a different problem. The Rambam says, what happens if the Bechar at the outset of Yom Tov was not a Baal Mum, and then it got injured on Yom Tov? So the owner is going to look and say, oh, the animal got a mum, the Bechar got a mum, let's check it and eat it for Yom Tov. And he's going to bring it to the Chacham, and he's going to show the mum to the Chacham. Okay, the Chacham looks at the mum. He says, yeah, it's a mum kavua. Yeah, it's mutter. Then he asks you, by the way, when did the mum happen? Oh, the mum just happened an hour ago. Oh, wait a second. If the mum just happened an hour ago, then this animal is muktzah. Because at the outset of Yom Tov, it was a Bechar that was not a Baal Mum. So that means that at the outset of Yom Tov, it wasn't royal shechitah. And it's only royal shechitah now on Yom Tov. But if it was muktzah ben hashmashas, it's muktzah for the whole Yom Tov. So here we have two different reasons why you can't paskin on a bechar on Yom Tov. One reason is because it's nira kemisakein, and that's what the Mishnah Berurah brings down here. The other reason is because if the mum happened on Yom Tov, then the animal is muktzah. And therefore, says the Rambam, the Chachamim were misakin that you can't paskin on a bechar bal mum, even if the mum happened before Yom Tov, because it's a takana. If people are going to paskin when a mum happened before Yom Tov, they're also going to come to ask shilas when a mum happened on Yom Tov, and they're going to come to be metaltal an animal that's muktzah. Okay, let's go weiter. I couldn't leave that out. I wanted to bring it down. Okay. So we're in the middle of the Mishnah Berurah here, Ois Kat Nun. So first, the Mishnah Berurah said the problem over here is by the Ois Kat Nun Zayin for the Sharet Zion, the Mersek Kemisakin da Aser b'Yom Tov. Now, the Chavetz Chaim goes weiter and he explains, V'loi dami l'shar ha'ra. Now you'll tell me, if when a Chacham paskins on a Bechar, that's a Shaila of Misakein, so how about other Shailas that you ask a Chacham? Let's say you go ask a Chacham on Shabbos, the Cholent, a Yid put the Cholent on the fire on Shabbos B'Shoigig. And I want to know, is the Cholent mutter, is the Cholent aser? So if the Rav is going to paskin that the Cholent is mutter, he was masakin the Cholent. So maybe it's also to ask a Rav a Shaila on Yom Tov, because it's merzi kimasakin. It says the Chavetz Chaim, no. V'loi dami l'shar ha'ra. The psak on the Bechar is not comparable to other piskei halachas that a Rav gives. She'ena iser v'aheter tali by ras pi hamoira. By other shilas, when the Rav gives a psak, the halacha is not dependent upon the psak of the Rav. Ela b'yedias hadavar. The psak of the Rav is, I, the shayl, am mechusar deya. There's something that I don't know. I don't know the halacha, and therefore I don't know how to comport myself. So I have to go to the Rav, and the Rav gives a psak, and he fills in my knowledge gaps. So he gave me the knowledge that I needed, but he didn't intrinsically render the item mutter or aser. If the cholent was mutter, then the cholent was mutter before the Rav gave the psak. Just I didn't know that it was mutter. So the Rav informed me that it was mutter. Before I was uninformed, and now I am informed. But the Rav didn't magically change the status of the cholent. The status of the cholent is whatever the status of the cholent is. So therefore, that's not merzi kimesaken. That's not true by a bechar. Ma'ashe'en kein bebechar, when it comes to the halacha of a bechar, afilu yesh by mum gamur. Even if a bechar has a very visible and a very well-known and well-understood mum kavua. Kol shelo hitiru oisei chacham. As long as a chacham did not render a psak, oy shloisha hedyotos, or at least a panel of 3 lesser people, if they didn't render a psak, ushchatai, and you shechted, aser. The bechar is aser. The halacha is, let's say you have a bechar, and you see the mum very clearly. It's a very obvious mum kavua. So you go ahead and you say, okay, it's a bechar bal mum, and you shechted it. Then your friend asks, I see you shechted the bechar. Did you get a psak? You say, no, I didn't need a psak. I had no shaila. I saw the mum. No. You need to go to a Talmid Chacham, and he needs to paskin. And now that you shechted it, it's too late. A psak that's given after the shechitah is not efficacious. That bechar is gone. It's not usable anymore. So by a bechar, when the Rav paskins on the bechar, he is intrinsically changing the status of that bechar. And therefore, that's merzi k'mesaken. Very cute. And I'll read to you a very interesting Dirshu footnote based on this. But first, let's go weiter. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut nun aleph, lir oisai. The Chacham is not allowed to go look at the bechar on Yom Tov. Ula HaTorah, he is not allowed to be matir it. Now, the words of the Mechaber is that the Chacham is not allowed to see it. Ein Chacham yachal lir oisai. So first, the Chavetz Chaim says that you should know that when the Mechaber says lir oisai, that the Chacham is not allowed to see it. He means he's not allowed to see it and paskin on it. It's not seeing it that's the problem. It's paskining on it that's the problem. Ava lirois bechar, But if the chacham wants to go look at a bechar on Yom Tov, ula ayin bedinoi, then he wants to go home and crack open the books and be ma'ayin in the halachah, but he's not going to give a psak lamaisa. Heavy kalima Torah ba'alma v'lo aser. That's limud HaTorah. He's allowed to do that. That's not a problem. Now on that, there's a Dirshu footnote number 48 that says over here. Let's say he wants to look at the bechar on Yom Tov, and he's really looking at it now to decide the shaila. Just he's not going to render the psak until tomorrow, until Isru Chag. That also, das again Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, sheyitachin shemuter. Rav Shlomo Zalman says it's possible that would be muter. Kevin shesayf sayf lo done b'Yom Tov is dinoi, as long because he didn't render the psak on Yom Tov, so he wasn't misakin anything on Yom Tov. Okay, let's do Eis Katan Nun Beis on Kuftes Amin Aleph. The Mechaber said, and even if the Talmid Chacham looks at the bechar on Yom Tov and he mistakenly renders the psak on Yom Tov, even though he wasn't allowed to, so then the Mechaber said, "Einu yochel l'shachtai." You're not allowed to shecht it. So you have a bechar. The Rav looked at it. He paskin that it was mutter. He wasn't supposed to, but he paskin that it was mutter. So now you have a completely usable bechar. You're not allowed to go ahead and shecht it on Yom Tov. Now, why is this? Why is that true? So the Chofetz Chaim explains. The fact that the Rav mistakenly rendered his psak on Yom Tov, that's not a reason to render the bechar aser, right? The only reason for the bechar to be aser l'chayra is if it has kedushas bechar and it's not a balmum, it's aser. But the Rav paskin that it is a balmum, so it's mutter. Now you're right; he wasn't allowed to give the psak. How does that make the animal aser? Explains the Chofetz Chaim. See again, muktzah creeps in over here. The reason it's aser is because of muktzah. Because when Yom Tov began, it wasn't a usable animal. It wasn't royal shechitah. The Rav had not paskined on it at Ben Hashmashos at the outset of Yom Tov. So at the outset of Yom Tov, it wasn't a usable animal. Certainly, if the mum happened on Yom Tov itself, certainly it was muktzah at the outset of Yom Tov. It wasn't about mum yet. But even if the mum happened before Yom Tov, you might make an argument that you might say like this: why is the animal muktzah? Why is the animal muktzah? It got a mum 2 days before Yom Tov. I had in mind that on Yom Tov, I'm going to ask a Rav, and if he paskins that it's mutter, I'm going to use the animal. So why is the animal muktzah? Why are you telling me that it wasn't roy at Ben Hashmashos? You're right that it wasn't roy at Ben Hashmashos because technically I didn't ask the shaila yet, but I wasn't mesiach das from the animal. My das was the same way. Was it edible at Ben Hashmashos? It wasn't edible. You're going to tell me, how could you shech the animal on Yom Tov? It wasn't roy lachila at Ben Hashmashos. But it doesn't matter. It was roy for use. I'm allowed to shecht it. I'm allowed to skin it. I'm allowed to kasher it. I'm allowed to traber it. And I'm allowed to cook it on Yom Tov. So it's roy for use. So why don't we say over here, okay, so the Rav didn't paskin on it yet. It already had a mum. If it didn't have a mum, so then you could tell me it's mamish, not roy. It's a bechar. It's kedushas bechar. It's not roy. But if it had a mum, and the only thing that's lacking is if I have to ask a shaila, so I had in my das that I'm going to ask a shaila. So I wasn't maktzadaita from it. I wasn't mesiach das. Still, the Chofetz Chaim says, nevertheless, since the halacha is midrabanan, that you're not allowed to show a Rav a mum on Yom Tov, and he's not allowed to paskin, that means that you are a mesiach das. Even if you don't realize that you were mesiach das from the animal, the Chachamim say that you were mesiach das, because the Chachamim said you're not allowed to ask this shaila on Yom Tov. So automatically it's mesiach das. Because what was your das? Your das was, I'm going to find 3 people that don't know the halachah. Even if you'll tell me, well, I didn't know the halachah at all. I didn't know you're not allowed to ask a shaila on Yom Tov. Doesn't matter. The Chacham say is aser, it's automatically muktzah. Because for Apaiskim the Lukuli Alma aser was there. Everybody would hold that this bechar is muktzah. Even according to the famous Ramah back in Taf Tzaddik Kesef Dalet, where we're mekel on muktzah, right? Like the bushel of the sack of apples that you put away for schera. So we had that machlekes, the Mechaber and the Ramah. Is it muktzah because you were Mesiach Das? Or we say no, because bottom line is, if you had a real hankering for an apple, you would take it out. So maybe you could say that over here also, but I wasn't really Mesiach Das. I didn't know the halachah. I thought I could ask a shayla. No. If it's an Issach HaChamim to ask the shayla, then automatically that's considered Hesach HaDas. Now, even though we've gone along over here, I still want to do footnote number 47. We said that there's a very cute difference between a standard issue shayla that you ask a Rav and the case of when you're asking about a Bechor. We said that when you typically ask a Rav a shayla, the Rav is not making an intrinsic status change to something. He's just filling in a knowledge gap that you happen to have. You're uninformed, and he's informing you. But by a Bechor, the Rav is really, when he makes his psak, he's changing the actual thing. He's making an intrinsic change in the status of the Bechor. Based on this concept of a psak halachah, you have a footnote over here, number 47. Ulachein, therefore, kishabolif de chacham she'ela, she'ena b'dinei mamanis. When a typical shayla comes to a Rav, not a chayshim mishpat shayla, but an isser v'heter shayla. V'yesh b'dei shaynis b'paiskim. And there are differences of opinion amongst the paiskim. Das hagayin Rav Nissen Karelitz, Rav Nissen Karelitz, Zakatak Levracha's opinion was, shemutal alav laharais kiminig rabbaisav shal hashayl. That the paisik has to paskin according to the opinions of the rabbeim of the shoyl. What does that mean? Kigoyin Ashkenazi shabal chacham Sfardi. Let's say an Ashkenazi comes to Rav Avadia Yosef, Zechat Tzaddik Kadosh Levracha, to ask him a shayla. And the Sfardim paskin one way, and the Ashkenazi paskin another way. Chayav hachacham lahiris like kibiskei rabbaisav Ashkenazim. Rav Avadia would have to paskin like the Ashkenazim. If an Ashkenazi asks a shayla, the paisik, even if he's a Sfardish paisik, has to paskin for the shayl. He has to give him a Ashkenazisha psak, v'chein lehepech, and so to the other way. Why? Me'atam shekosav kan, for the reasoning that we're giving here. Shahalacha ina tluya b'heiras hamoira, because the halacha is not being set by the paisik. The paisik is not setting the halacha. The halacha is oimid. The halacha is already there. He's just filling in the knowledge gap of the shayl. But the knowledge gap of this shayl is an Ashkenazi knowledge gap. He's an Ashkenazi. He follows that Ashkenazi halacha. So that's what he needs to know. He's not asking about Sfardi halacha. Elevated dias hadavar. Very interesting. How you see, if that's the way we look at the psak of a halacha, right? So you have to answer the shayl according to his minhagim, not according to Fremd minhagim. Okay, we'll see if I'll get to do another share yet today. I'm not sure. If not, so we're one day behind. I'm fully confident that we'll catch up. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Schus of limud HaTorah should be megan on Gans Klal Yisrael. The Ransham should send Yeshua's, Refuah's, Parnasa, everything good to everyone that needs anything. The Ransham should shik everything good. We still have time. We still have a little time before Rosh Chodesh Av. The Ransham should send the Bias Gael Tzedek. We shouldn't have a 9 days. We shouldn't have a Tisha B'Av. Shesh, come now. Let him come now. We'll all get up very happily. Go to Eretz Yisrael and be Mekayim our Chiyuvim to be Ovdei Hashem the right way, the way the Rebbe Shalom wants us to, with all full Tayyag mitzvahs, with the Beis HaMikdash, with Karbanos, with everything. Okay, be well.